Have you ever watched a single throw and immediately felt like it meant more than everyone was saying? Not because it was the greatest pass ever thrown, not because it happened in a playoff game, and not because it broke the internet for a week, but because something about it felt different. Something about it felt like the beginning of a much larger story. That's exactly what happened in Cleveland when Shedeur Sanders dropped back during an OTA session and launched a perfect strike to Isaiah Bond in the back of the end zone. On the surface, it looked like a simple offseason highlight, the kind of play that gets reposted a few times before fans move on. But the reaction afterward told a completely different story. Coaches noticed it, reporters noticed it, teammates noticed it, and perhaps most importantly, people inside the Browns organization appeared to notice it. Because what happened next wasn't just excitement about a nice touchdown throw, it was the start of a conversation that suddenly became impossible to ignore. For months, the narrative surrounding Cleveland's quarterback room seemed straightforward. Deshaun Watson was expected to remain at the center of the discussion. After all, he was the veteran quarterback tied to one of the largest contracts in NFL history. He was the player the organization had invested everything in just a few years earlier. Even after injuries, setbacks, and endless criticism, there were still people who believed the path back to the starting job belonged to him. The assumption was simple. Watson would eventually reclaim his position while Shedeur Sanders continued developing somewhere behind the scenes. That was the story many expected to hear throughout the offseason. That was the safe prediction. That was the narrative that seemed destined to dominate headlines heading into training camp. But football rarely follows the script people write for it months in advance. The moment players step onto the field, reputations stop mattering as much, contracts stop mattering as much, draft status stops mattering as much. Eventually, performance becomes the only language anyone cares about. And that's where this story starts getting interesting, because Shedeur Sanders wasn't supposed to be generating this level of buzz this quickly. Just a short time ago, he was the quarterback everyone was debating after his shocking slide in the draft. Teams passed on him over and over again. Analysts questioned whether he would ever get a real opportunity. Critics wondered if the attention surrounding his famous last name created expectations that would be impossible to meet. Some people even suggested that he would spend years trying to escape the shadow of his father before being taken seriously as an NFL quarterback. Yet through all of the criticism, all of the questions, and all of the noise, Sanders kept doing the same thing. He kept working, he kept learning, he kept improving. And now, suddenly, the conversation surrounding him feels completely different than it did just a year ago. What makes this situation even more fascinating is that the touchdown to Isaiah Bond wasn't really the story at all. The throw was simply the latest piece of evidence. The real story is the growing belief that something is changing inside the Browns organization. Every practice report, every coaching comment, every first-team rep, and every positive review has slowly added fuel to a conversation that wasn't supposed to happen this soon. Little by little, people have started asking a question that would have sounded ridiculous months ago. What if Shedeur Sanders isn't just competing for a roster spot? What if he isn't simply developing for the future? What if he's legitimately forcing Cleveland to rethink its entire quarterback timeline? Those questions are becoming harder to dismiss with each passing week, and that's exactly why this story has captured so much attention across the NFL. Because when you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, this suddenly becomes about much more than one quarterback battle. It becomes about the future direction of an entire franchise. The Browns have spent decades searching for stability at the most important position in sports. They've cycled through veterans, draft picks, expensive acquisitions, and short-term solutions, all while searching for the player who could finally change everything. Now, standing in the middle of this latest chapter is a young quarterback who continues to gain momentum every time he steps on the field. The touchdown throw to Isaiah Bond didn't officially win him the starting job. It didn't guarantee anything about the future, but it did accomplish something that may prove even more important. It forced people to pay attention.
And once you start paying attention to everything happening in Cleveland right now, you begin to realize that this quarterback competition may be telling us far more about the Browns' future than anyone originally expected.
Long before the touchdown passes, the OTA highlights, in the growing quarterback competition in Cleveland, there was a moment that Shedeur Sanders probably won't ever forget. It wasn't a moment of celebration. It wasn't a moment of validation. It was a moment of disbelief. As the NFL draft unfolded, analysts, scouts, and fans across the country watched one of the most unexpected slides in recent memory. Quarterback after quarterback came off the board. Team after team passed on Sanders. The cameras kept cutting back to him waiting. The questions started growing louder. What were teams seeing that everyone else wasn't? How could a quarterback who had produced at a high level in college, handled enormous pressure, and consistently played under the brightest spotlight in college football suddenly become someone franchises wanted to avoid? Nobody seemed to have a clear answer. Every pick that passed created more confusion, more speculation, and more conversation. By the time the draft finally reached the later rounds, what started as a surprise had become the biggest storyline of the entire event. The criticism wasn't new to Sanders. In many ways, he'd been dealing with it for years. Ever since becoming the son of one of the most recognizable figures in football history, expectations followed him everywhere. Every throw was analyzed. Every mistake became a headline. Every success was dismissed by critics, who claimed his opportunities existed only because of his last name. While other quarterbacks were allowed to develop quietly, Sanders grew up under a microscope. Some people believed he was overrated. Others believed he was unfairly criticized. But regardless of which side you were on, there was no denying one thing. Very few young quarterbacks entered the NFL carrying more pressure on their shoulders. And when draft night turned into a public slide down the board, that pressure intensified even further. What made the situation even more surprising was that Sanders had already proven he could handle adversity. Throughout his college career, he played behind offensive lines that often struggled to protect him. He absorbed hits that would have rattled many quarterbacks. He carried enormous expectations while playing for his father, knowing that every performance would be judged through a different lens than everyone else. Yet, despite those challenges, he continued producing. He continued competing. He continued showing flashes of the arm talent, confidence, and leadership that had made him one of the most talked-about quarterbacks in college football. That's why so many people were stunned when NFL teams kept passing on him. The gap between perception and reality seemed larger with every passing round. As the draft continued, countless theories began circulating. Some observers questioned whether teams were concerned about the spotlight that would accompany Sanders wherever he went. Others wondered if organizations feared the constant media attention attached to the Sanders name. There were reports, rumors, and endless speculation about interviews, evaluations, and pre-draft meetings. But the truth is that very few people outside NFL front offices actually knew why the slide happened. What everyone did know was that a player who many expected to hear his name called much earlier was suddenly experiencing one of the most uncomfortable nights of his football career. And while the football world debated what went wrong, Sanders was quietly receiving something that would eventually become fuel. Because humiliation has a funny way of creating motivation. Some players responded disappointment by making excuses. Others spend months talking about how unfair the situation was. Sanders took a different approach. Instead of launching into public complaints, he went to work. Instead of focusing on the teams that passed on him, he focused on proving they were wrong. The draft slide instantly became part of his story, but it didn't become his identity. In fact, many people inside football circles believe it may have accelerated his development. Suddenly, there was no room for entitlement, no room for distractions, no room for believing he had already arrived. Every practice mattered, every rep mattered, every opportunity mattered, and that mindset started showing up the moment he arrived in Cleveland.
What's often forgotten now is that expectations for Sanders entering his rookie season were actually fairly modest. Most analysts viewed him as a developmental quarterback, a long-term project, someone who would spend time learning the speed of the NFL before eventually competing for a larger role down the road. Very few people expected him to become one of the most discussed young cornerbacks in the league this quickly. But football rarely cares about projections, it cares about growth. And over the course of his rookie season, Sanders gradually began showing signs that he might be developing faster than many expected. The statistics weren't perfect. There were mistakes, there were learning moments, there were games that exposed areas he still needed to improve. But there were also flashes that made coaches pay attention, flashes that made teammates believe, flashes that made fans start wondering whether the draft slide had become one of the biggest mistakes several franchises would eventually regret.
Looking back now, it's becoming increasingly clear that draft night may have changed more than just Sanders' destination. It may have changed his entire mindset. Every criticism became motivation. Every doubt became fuel. Every team that passed on him became another reason to keep improving. And that's exactly why the current quarterback battle in Cleveland feels so important. Because this isn't simply the story of a young player trying to win a starting job. This is the continuation of a journey that began the moment dozens of NFL decision-makers decided someone else was the better option. Sanders has been chasing that moment ever since. And now, with every practice, every highlight throw, and every positive report coming out of Cleveland, he's starting to look like a player determined to make sure nobody ever forgets it. But while the draft slide created the motivation, another storyline was quietly developing behind the scenes, one that would make Sanders' path to the starting job even more complicated than anyone expected. If Shedeur Sanders' draft slide created the motivation, the situation waiting for him in Cleveland created an even bigger challenge. Because the moment he arrived, there was already a quarterback storyline dominating the building, the media, and the fan base. And for a long time, almost nobody questioned it. The assumption was simple. Whenever Deshaun Watson was healthy enough to return, the job would eventually be his. That belief became so widespread that many people treated it as a fact rather than an opinion. Before a single OTA pass had been thrown, before a single training camp battle had taken place, and before the coaching staff had a real opportunity to evaluate the quarterbacks side by side, the narrative already seemed established. Watson was viewed as the favorite. Sanders was viewed as the future possibility. The hierarchy appeared set, at least on paper. To understand why that narrative became so powerful, you have to understand the magnitude of the investment Cleveland made. Few decisions in modern NFL history carried as much risk as the Browns' decision to acquire Watson and hand him a fully guaranteed contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars. At the time, the move was presented as the final piece that would transform Cleveland into a legitimate contender. The Browns believed they were acquiring one of football's elite quarterbacks, a player capable of changing the direction of the franchise for years to come. The expectation wasn't simply that Watson would play well. The expectation was that he would become the face of the organization. When a team commits that level of money, attention, and resources to one player, the relationship becomes bigger than football. Every success is magnified. Every failure becomes impossible to ignore. The problem was that reality never unfolded the way Cleveland imagined. Injuries interrupted seasons. Consistency never fully arrived. Questions continued to follow the organization. Instead of becoming the stabilizing force the Browns envisioned, Deshaun Watson's tenure became one of the most debated topics in the entire league. Yet despite everything that had happened, there were still people who believed the organization would continue giving him opportunities. Some reports suggested Watson remained firmly in the quarterback conversation. Others claimed he still had a legitimate path back to the starting role. Whether those reports reflected reality or simply reflected assumptions about the financial investment is something only people inside the building truly know. But what cannot be denied is that the perception remained powerful.
Many observers continued treating Watson as the quarterback to beat. That's where things started becoming interesting, because while the public discussion focused heavily on Watson's potential return, there was another question that never seemed to receive enough attention. What exactly was that belief based on? Watson had spent significant time away from meaningful game action. The injuries had limited opportunities to evaluate where he truly stood compared to earlier stages of his career. Everyone remembered the version of Watson that once electrified the league with his athleticism, arm talent, and playmaking ability. Everyone remembered the quarterback who could take over games and carry an offense. But memories and reality aren't always the same thing. The NFL changes quickly, injuries change careers, time changes players, and yet much of the conversation continued to revolve around who Watson used to be rather than who he currently was. At the same time, another factor was quietly influencing how people viewed the competition. Organizations rarely enjoy admitting massive investments didn't produce the desired outcome. That's true in sports, business, and virtually every other industry. Human nature makes it difficult to walk away from something you've spent years defending. When a franchise commits enormous resources to a player, there is naturally pressure to make that decision work. Fans feel it, executives feel it, ownership feels it. The desire to justify past decisions can become incredibly powerful. That's why some observers began wondering whether parts of the Deshaun Watson narrative were being driven by expectation rather than performance. Was he truly the frontrunner because of what he was currently showing on the field, or was he the frontrunner because people assumed he had to be? The difference between those two explanations is enormous.
Meanwhile, Shedeur Sanders found himself in a fascinating position. He wasn't carrying the pressure of defending a massive contract. He wasn't carrying years of organizational expectations. Nobody expected him to walk into the building and immediately own the quarterback room. In many ways, that gave him something valuable: freedom. Every positive throw became a bonus. Every improvement became noticeable. Every step forward exceeded expectations. While the spotlight remained focused on Watson's comeback attempt, Sanders quietly continued stacking good days together, and because expectations were lower, those good days started generating more attention than many people anticipated. What made the situation even more complicated was the arrival of a new coaching staff. Whenever a new head coach enters a building, old assumptions suddenly become less important. Previous investments don't necessarily carry the same weight. Prior depth charts don't automatically remain intact. Coaches want to evaluate players through their own eyes. They want to determine who gives them the best chance to succeed moving forward. That's exactly why the quarterback conversation entering the offseason felt far more open than many outsiders realized. Publicly, nobody was rushing to make declarations. Nobody was announcing a winner. Nobody was guaranteeing anything. But privately, evaluations were happening every single day. And those evaluations would eventually create a reality that no media narrative could control. Because football always has a way of exposing the truth. No matter how many reports circulate, no matter how many opinions dominate television segments, no matter how much money is attached to a contract, eventually, coaches have to trust what they see on the practice field. They have to trust what players show them when the ball is snapped. And as off-season practices began unfolding in Cleveland, something unexpected started happening. The quarterback many people viewed as a developmental project wasn't acting like a developmental project anymore. The quarterback many assumed needed years before becoming a serious contender was beginning to force his way into every conversation. Suddenly, the narrative that nobody questioned started developing cracks, and once those cracks appeared, people began paying much closer attention to what was actually happening on the field. Then, something happened that completely changed the conversation. The theories stopped mattering. The assumptions stopped mattering. The off-season narratives that had dominated headlines for months suddenly ran into a very simple problem. People could actually watch the practices. Reporters were standing on the sidelines, cameras were recording portions of the sessions, coaches were evaluating every rep, and when observers began comparing what they expected to see versus what they were actually seeing, a noticeable gap started emerging.
The quarterback who was supposed to be quietly developing wasn't blending into the background. He wasn't looking overwhelmed. He wasn't acting like a player years away from competing. Instead, Shedeur Sanders was steadily becoming one of the most talked about players on the field. What immediately stood out wasn't necessarily one specific throw or one spectacular highlight. It was the consistency of the reports. When multiple reporters attend practices and leave with similar observations, people start paying attention. Again and again, the discussion seemed to return to Sanders. His confidence looked different. His command of the offense looked different. His comfort level looked different. Instead of appearing like a young quarterback trying to survive NFL practices, he looked like someone becoming increasingly comfortable operating within the offense. That's an important distinction, because confidence at quarterback tends to be contagious. Teammates notice it, coaches notice it, receivers notice it. The entire energy around a player can change when people begin believing he belongs. What's fascinating is that Todd Monken never gave the media much to work with publicly. Throughout the offseason, he remained extremely disciplined with his messaging. He wasn't handing out starting jobs in June. He wasn't creating headlines with dramatic declarations. Every time questions about the quarterback competition surfaced, Monken consistently emphasized evaluation, competition, development, patience. From a coaching perspective, it made perfect sense. There was no reason to rush a decision. There was no reason to create unnecessary distractions. But while Monken was carefully managing expectations publicly, the practice field was telling its own story, and that story was becoming harder to ignore with each passing week. One of the biggest indicators came from the opportunities Sanders was receiving. Whenever quarterbacks begin earning meaningful reps alongside higher-level players, people inside the building take notice. Coaches don't hand out those opportunities simply because a player has potential. Those opportunities have to be earned. Every rep is valuable. Every snap is part of an evaluation process. And as off-season sessions unfolded in Cleveland, Sanders continued finding himself involved in situations that suggested the coaching staff wanted a serious look at what he could do. That alone raised eyebrows, because while public discussions continued revolving around veteran experience and established expectations, the coaching staff appeared focused on gathering as much information as possible about the young quarterback's ceiling. Then came the throw that seemed to accelerate everything.
By now, most Browns fans have probably seen the clip multiple times. Sanders drops back, the pocket remains clean, he scans the field, then he unleashes a deep pass toward Isaiah Bond that lands exactly where it needs to be. The ball travels with perfect touch, perfect timing, and perfect placement. Bond finishes the play in the back of the end zone, and suddenly, social media explodes. But what made the moment significant wasn't simply the touchdown itself. Great throws happen every day in football. What made this one different was the reaction afterward. The play instantly became one of the defining highlights of Cleveland's offseason program. People weren't just talking about the result, they were talking about what the throw represented. Because for many observers, that play showcased everything that makes Sanders intriguing. The arm talent, the confidence, the willingness to attack vertically, the trust in his receiver. These are traits that coaches spend years trying to develop in young quarterbacks. Some players never fully acquire them, others possess them naturally. And when Sanders launched that ball without hesitation, it reminded everyone why he generated so much excitement before ever taking an NFL snap. The physical tools were never the question. The question was always how quickly he could develop the finer details of playing quarterback at the highest level. Every positive report coming out of OTAs suggested those details might be improving faster than expected. What really fueled the growing excitement, however, was the emergence of insider conversations. Suddenly, there were reports suggesting people within the organization were impressed with Sanders' progress. Discussions about his growth started appearing more frequently. Local analysts began openly debating whether he had a legitimate chance to push for the starting role sooner than anticipated. The language surrounding him started changing. Earlier in the offseason, many people described him as a developmental prospect. Now, more observers were describing him as a legitimate competitor. That's a significant shift. Developmental projects are players you hope can contribute someday. Competitors are players who force difficult decisions. And perhaps that's what made this entire situation so fascinating. The further practices progressed, the harder it became to place Sanders into the neat little box many people had created for him. He wasn't behaving like a long-term backup. He wasn't looking like someone content to sit quietly and wait for years. Every report seemed to point toward a quarterback growing more comfortable, more aggressive, and more confident in his abilities. The gap between expectation and reality continued getting smaller. And every time that happened, the pressure on the existing narrative grew larger. Because eventually, football people start asking uncomfortable questions. If the young quarterback continues improving, how long can you keep calling him a project? If he keeps making plays, how long can you keep saying he's not ready? And if he continues stacking impressive practices together, how long before the competition becomes much closer than anyone originally anticipated? Those questions were suddenly everywhere, but the most interesting part was that the person creating them wasn't saying much at all. Shedeur Sanders simply kept showing up, taking his reps, and letting his performance do the talking. And while reporters were busy documenting what they saw on the field, Todd Monken was quietly watching something even more important unfold. Because behind the highlight throws and growing excitement, there was another development that may have mattered even more than the touchdowns themselves. The most interesting part of this entire story isn't the touchdown pass. It isn't the social media clips. It isn't even the growing excitement surrounding Shedeur Sanders. The most interesting part is Todd Monken. Because while everyone else was debating quarterbacks, breaking down highlights, and trying to predict who would eventually win the job, the Browns head coach was quietly sending messages that many people completely missed. Not loud messages, not dramatic messages, not the kind that dominate sports talk shows for a week. The kind of messages football people recognize immediately because they understand how coaches operate. And if you paid close attention to what Monken was saying throughout the offseason, a fascinating pattern started emerging. From the moment he arrived in Cleveland, Monken made one thing clear: nobody was going to be handed anything. Not because of draft position, not because of contract size, not because of reputation. Every quarterback would be evaluated based on what they showed on the field. That may sound like standard coach speak, but in reality, it's a very important distinction. Coaches often reveal their intentions without directly revealing them. They do it through the players they praise. They do it through the details they emphasize. They do it through the names they voluntarily bring up during press conferences. And throughout much of the offseason, Monken seemed determined to avoid making headlines. He wasn't interested in naming favorites. He wasn't interested in feeding the media. He wasn't interested in creating unnecessary distractions. Yet, despite that careful approach, there were moments when his true evaluations started slipping through the cracks. One of those moments came after the now famous touchdown throw to Isaiah Bond. On the surface, Monken's comments sounded simple enough. He praised the play, he complimented Bond, he acknowledged Sanders. Nothing outrageous, nothing controversial. But context matters. This is a coach who spent months refusing to overreact publicly to almost anything. This is a coach who consistently redirected questions away from individual praise and back toward the team. So when someone like Monken voluntarily starts mentioning a young quarterback's growth, football people notice, because coaches don't accidentally praise players during quarterback competitions. Every word is measured, every comment is intentional, every observation carries weight. What made those comments even more revealing was the specific language Monken used. He didn't simply praise Sanders' arm talent. Everyone already knew Sanders had arm talent. He didn't simply compliment a throw. One impressive pass isn't enough to earn genuine trust from an NFL coaching staff. Instead, Monken repeatedly pointed toward development, growth, progress, decision-making, processing. Those are the words that matter, Those are the qualities coaches obsess over because they're the traits that determine whether a quarterback can survive on Sundays. A strong arm might get you drafted. Good decision-making keeps you employed. And when Monken started highlighting improvements in those areas, it suggested he was seeing something much more important than highlight reel plays. That's because NFL coaches care far less about spectacular throws than fans realize. Fans remember touchdowns. Coaches remember reads. Fans celebrate deep balls. Coaches study footwork. Fans see the result. Coaches evaluate the process. A quarterback can throw a beautiful touchdown and still receive criticism from his coaching staff if he made the wrong read beforehand. On the other hand, a quarterback can throw an incomplete pass and receive praise if he correctly diagnosed the defense and made the right decision. That's why Monken's comments regarding Sanders' progress were so significant. They suggested improvements in the areas that truly determine whether a quarterback is ready to lead an offense. Even more interesting was what Monken chose not to say. At no point did he crown Sanders the future franchise quarterback. At no point did he declare the competition over. At no point did he publicly diminish Watson or anyone else competing for the job. That's exactly what made his comments so powerful. They weren't emotional, they weren't reactionary. They sounded like the observations of a coach carefully documenting a player's development. And sometimes that type of praise carries far more value than a bold endorsement. Public declarations can create headlines. Quiet confidence creates opportunities. The deeper this offseason progressed, the more reports surfaced suggesting Sanders was improving in exactly the areas Monken wanted to see. Faster decisions, better processing, more comfort within the offense, increased confidence attacking defenses. Those aren't accidental improvements. Those are signs of a quarterback beginning to understand the speed of the NFL game. And for a young player, that's often the difference between being viewed as a prospect and being viewed as a legitimate contender. The physical tools get your foot in the door. Mental growth determines how far you can go once you're inside. What's fascinating is that Monken's coaching history makes these comments even more meaningful. This isn't a coach who has spent his career working with average quarterbacks. He's seen high-level talent. He's worked around successful offenses. He's evaluated players at both the college and professional levels. When someone with that background begins discussing a quarterback's growth, people inside football circles listen differently. They understand that praise from experienced coaches is often difficult to earn, particularly for young quarterbacks. Coaches know how dangerous hype can be. They know how quickly expectations can spiral out of control. That's why they're usually conservative with compliments, which makes it all the more notable when those compliments appear anyway. But perhaps the biggest hidden message wasn't contained in anything Monken said. It was contained in how he continued treating Sanders throughout the evaluation process. The opportunities remained there, the reps remained there, the attention remained there. Nothing suggested the coaching staff viewed him as a player simply occupying a roster spot. Quite the opposite. Every indication pointed toward a quarterback receiving a legitimate opportunity to prove himself. And in a league where opportunities are often determined long before fans realize it, that may have been the loudest message of all. Because while everyone outside the building was focused on who should win the competition, Monken appeared focused on something else entirely. He was evaluating who could lead the next version of the Cleveland Browns, not just next week, not just next month, the next version. And as those evaluations continued, another development was quietly unfolding behind the scenes, one that made Sanders' rise feel far less accidental and much more connected to the Browns' long-term vision for the future.
While most fans were busy debating quarterbacks, there was another story unfolding in Cleveland that received far less attention. In fact, many people completely missed it. They were so focused on the battle between Shedeur Sanders and Deshaun Watson that they never stopped to ask a much bigger question. What exactly are the Browns trying to become? Because when you step back and look beyond the daily practice reports, beyond the highlight clips, and beyond the quarterback headlines, a larger pattern starts to emerge. And once you see that pattern, Shedeur Sanders' rise suddenly looks far less surprising. In many ways, it starts looking inevitable. The easiest mistake people make when analyzing NFL teams is focusing on individual players instead of organizational direction. Franchises don't make major decisions based on one season. They don't rebuild entire rosters around short-term emotions. The smartest organizations operate according to timelines. They identify where they are, where they want to go, and which players fit the journey. Every major move becomes part of a larger blueprint. Every draft pick serves a purpose. Every roster decision points toward a future vision. That's why some of Cleveland's recent moves deserve far more attention than they're receiving, because the front office may be telling us exactly where this franchise is headed without ever holding a press conference to announce it. For years, the Browns were built around a very specific core. Veteran players carried the identity of the team. The focus was on winning immediately. Every move reflected urgency. The organization believed it was 1 or 2 pieces away from becoming a legitimate contender. That's part of what made the Watson acquisition so significant. It wasn't a move designed for 3 years down the road, it was a move designed to win now. The Browns weren't planning for the future, they were attempting to accelerate it. But when that vision failed to unfold the way everyone hoped, reality forced difficult conversations inside the building. At some point, every franchise has to decide whether to keep chasing the same path or start building a new one. And lately, Cleveland's actions have started looking a lot like a team building something new. Look at the roster. Look at the players receiving attention. Look at the young talent being developed. Suddenly, the focus isn't solely on established veterans anymore. There is increasing emphasis on youth, upside, and long-term growth. That's not an accident. NFL organizations don't accidentally shift their priorities. Those changes happen because decision-makers believe the future requires a different foundation than the present. And when you examine the Browns through that lens, an interesting question emerges. Which quarterback actually fits that vision best? That's where Shedeur Sanders enters the conversation in a way many people never expected. Forget the touchdowns for a moment. Forget the highlight clips, and forget the excitement surrounding his development. Ask yourself a simple question. If Cleveland is truly building toward the next 5 to 10 years, which quarterback aligns with that timeline? A young player still improving, still developing, and still growing into his potential? Or an older veteran whose future with the organization remains uncertain? That's not an attack on Watson. It's simply the reality every NFL team faces. Age matters. Contracts matter. Long-term planning matters. Organizations constantly evaluate whether today's decisions support tomorrow's goals. And when viewed through that perspective, Shedeur Sanders becomes far more than a quarterback prospect. He becomes a potential centerpiece. What's fascinating is that some of the smaller details around the roster seem to support this idea. Young offensive players are receiving opportunities. Developmental pieces are being pushed into larger roles. Coaches continue talking about growth and progression. There is an energy surrounding the younger core that feels different from previous years. It feels like a team trying to establish its next identity. And if that's true, the quarterback position becomes even more important, because no player influences a franchise's direction more than the quarterback. If Cleveland believes it has found someone capable of leading that next chapter, everything else begins falling into place. The timing of Shedeur Sanders' emergence makes this even more compelling. Had these reports surfaced during a period when the Browns were clearly pushing all their chips toward immediate contention, the interpretation might be different. But that's not what appears to be happening. Instead, we're seeing a team increasingly focused on development, evaluation, and future growth. That's exactly the type of environment where young quarterbacks can thrive. They aren't being asked to save the franchise overnight, they're being asked to grow alongside it. And for a player like Sanders, that may be the perfect situation. What's even more revealing is how naturally he seems to fit within this evolving structure. Sometimes talented players arrive in organizations at the wrong time. The fit never fully develops. The roster is not aligned. The timing doesn't work. But occasionally, a player arrives precisely when a franchise needs him most. That's what makes the current situation in Cleveland so intriguing.
Sanders isn't forcing himself into a stable quarterback hierarchy. He's emerging at the exact moment the organization appears to be redefining itself. Those two developments occurring simultaneously may not be coincidence at all.
Of course, none of this guarantees anything. NFL futures are notoriously unpredictable. Prospects fail, plans change, injuries alter trajectories, front offices make unexpected decisions every year. But what makes this story impossible to ignore is that the evidence keeps pointing in the same direction. The Browns appear to be getting younger. The Browns appear to be thinking long-term. The Browns appear to be creating opportunities for players who fit that vision. And standing directly in the center of that movement is Shedeur Sanders. That's why focusing solely on the quarterback competition may actually miss the bigger story. This isn't just about who takes the first snap of Week 1. This is about where the franchise is headed over the next decade. It's about whether Cleveland has finally found a player capable of growing alongside an entirely new era of Browns football. And if that's what we're witnessing, then the OTA highlights, the positive reports, and the growing excitement are only the beginning. Because before anyone hands Sanders the future, there is still one major obstacle standing in the way of the hype, one criticism that refuses to disappear, one question even his biggest supporters still can't fully answer. And until that question is resolved, the debate surrounding his future isn't going anywhere. As impressive as Shedeur Sanders' rise has been, there is one reason why Todd Monken still hasn't handed him the keys to the franchise. There is one reason why the quarterback competition remains open. There is one reason why even some of Sanders' biggest supporters continue adding a small disclaimer whenever they praise him. The reality is simple. Sanders is improving, but he is not a finished product. And if we're going to have an honest conversation about his future, we have to talk about the biggest concern that continues following him from college into the NFL. Because while highlight throws generate excitement, coaches build offenses around consistency. And right now, consistency remains the final hurdle standing between Sanders and becoming the unquestioned future of the Cleveland Browns. The easiest mistake fans make during offseason hype season is falling in love with potential while ignoring the details. Every young quarterback looks exciting when you isolate the best moments. Every prospect appears unstoppable when you're only watching touchdown passes. The challenge comes when you evaluate every snap, every read, every decision, every mistake. That's where NFL coaching staffs separate themselves from fans. They're not looking for reasons to get excited. They're looking for reasons to trust you. And trust is earned through repetition. It's earned by making the right decision over and over again until coaches stop worrying about what might happen when the pressure arrives. For Sanders, the biggest concern has never been arm strength. It has never been confidence. It has never been toughness. In fact, those are some of the qualities people praise most often when discussing his game. The concern has always centered around timing and decision-making. More specifically, how quickly he processes what defenses are showing him. At the college level, elite athletic ability can sometimes compensate for hesitation. In the NFL, hesitation is deadly. The difference between a completion and a turnover is often measured in fractions of a second. Quarterbacks don't have the luxury of waiting for receivers to become obviously open. They must anticipate. They must react instantly. They must recognize what defenses are trying to disguise before the ball is even snapped. That's why some of Monken's most revealing comments this offseason weren't compliments, they were coaching points. There were moments during practices where Sanders would make an impressive throw only for the coaching staff to focus on something entirely different. Instead of celebrating the result, they examined the process. Did he get through his reads quickly enough? Did he identify the coverage immediately? Did he drift in the pocket longer than necessary? These are the details that determine whether a quarterback can consistently succeed against NFL defenses, and according to multiple observations from off-season practices, those remain areas where Sanders continues developing. One example perfectly illustrates the challenge. There were reports of Sanders making a beautiful completion after extending a play and buying himself extra time. To most fans, the throw looked fantastic.
To coaches, however, the concern wasn't the throw itself. The concern was whether he should have been holding the ball that long in the first place. In a practice setting, a quarterback might get away with drifting backward and waiting for a receiver to uncover. On Sundays, against elite pass rushers, that same play could end with a sack, a fumble, or a drive-killing mistake. That's the difference between evaluating highlights and evaluating quarterbacks. Coaches are always thinking about what happens when the environment becomes less forgiving.
And to be fair, this isn't some devastating flaw unique to Sanders. In fact, it's one of the most common challenges young quarterbacks face when transitioning to the NFL. The game moves faster, defenses disguise more, windows close quicker. Players who dominated in college suddenly discover that every decision must happen almost instantly. Some quarterbacks take years to adjust, others never fully adapt. The encouraging part for Cleveland is that reports suggest Sanders is improving in exactly these areas. Coaches have repeatedly pointed toward his progress. Observers have noted faster decision-making. Teammates have spoken about increased confidence within the offense. The trend appears positive. But positive trends and finished development are two very different things. This is where the excitement surrounding Sanders must remain balanced with reality. There are moments when fans begin talking about him as if he's already arrived, as if the competition is over, as if the future has already been decided. But if that were true, there wouldn't be a competition in the first place. The Browns are still evaluating. Monken is still evaluating. Every practice remains part of a larger process designed to answer one critical question. Can Sanders consistently execute at a level that earns complete trust from the coaching staff? Not occasionally, not during OTA highlights, consistently. The numbers from his early NFL experience tell part of the story as well. There were flashes that excited people. There were throws that demonstrated why many believed he could become a starter. But there were also mistakes. There were interceptions. There were missed opportunities. There were moments where the game sped up on him. That's normal for young quarterbacks. Development isn't a straight line. Growth rarely happens without setbacks. The problem is that NFL fans often expect instant results. They see a few impressive plays and assume greatness is right around the corner. Coaches know better. Coaches understand that true quarterback development happens through hundreds of small improvements that nobody notices. What's fascinating is that this weakness may actually be the strongest argument in Sanders' favor. Not because the issue doesn't exist, but because he appears to be addressing it. That's the part many critics overlook. Nobody inside Cleveland is pretending Sanders has already mastered every aspect of quarterback play. The excitement exists because improvement is visible. The processing appears faster, the confidence appears stronger, the understanding of the offense appears deeper. If those areas were stagnant, the conversation would look very different. Instead, reports consistently point toward a player moving in the right direction. And that's exactly why training camp becomes so important. Because OTAs are controlled environments. There are limitations, there are restrictions, the intensity is different. Defenders aren't attacking quarterbacks the same way they will once camp begins. Everything changes when the pads come on. Everything changes when pressure becomes real. Everything changes when mistakes carry greater consequences. That's where Sanders' biggest question will finally receive its most important test. Can he process quickly enough when chaos arrives? Can he make fast decisions when defenders are closing in? Can he eliminate the hesitation that occasionally shows up in his game? Those questions remain unanswered, and until they're answered, the debate surrounding his future will continue. But the fact that we're even asking those questions represents how far he's already come. Months ago, people wondered if he belonged in the conversation at all. Now, the conversation revolves around whether he's ready to take the final step. That's a completely different discussion. And as training camp approaches, it may also become the most important one. Because the next stage of this story won't be decided by highlight throws or optimistic reports. It will be decided when the pressure becomes real. And that's exactly where the future of Cleveland's quarterback room may finally be revealed.